The Souls-like genre of games has been one of the biggest in the gaming industry over the past decade or so after the success of Dark Souls, but most of these other games are just mediocre games trying to cash in on Dark Souls' success. I've played lots of these other games over the years on top of being the Souls series multiple times at this point. So when I finally played a small little indie game called Elderborn, I expected it to fall into the cash grab category of these clones, but I was actually pleasantly surprised to find out that it's honestly one of the best in the genre in my opinion. So today, join me as we try and figure out why no one's talking about Elderborn. Now for those unaware, the Souls-like term has come to mean any game that has enough mechanics borrowed from the Dark Souls franchise to be a quote-unquote clone of it, but this usually isn't used as a negative connotation, and instead an easy way for people to understand how a lot of these basic mechanics work by comparing it to Dark Souls. These mechanics can include things like brutal difficulty, a sort of currency given to the player for killing enemies that's lost upon death, using said currency to upgrade player stats, slow and methodical combat, complex and interconnected level design, and hard but fair boss battles that usually rely on memorizing attacks and tells. Most of these so-called Souls-likes don't take all of these mechanics, and more so just pick and choose a few they want to incorporate into their game, and then add in a few of their own mechanics to give it their own unique twist. In Elderborn's case, this was its use of first-person perspective and the parry mechanic. Now, I know that saying that a game is first-person doesn't really sound like a feature or a unique mechanic, considering games have been first-person since all the way back to the first Wolfenstein game, but Souls-likes are almost exclusively in third person. The Dark Souls series and all the clones that it spawned are made in third person because being spatially aware of what's going on around your character is honestly one of the strongest tools in those games. So by limiting to a first person perspective, you limit the player's spatial awareness to just what's around you, which when some enemies can kill you in 1 or 2 hits could possibly lead to a lot of frustrating deaths. But thankfully, Elderborn manages to avoid most of these pitfalls that could happen by choosing a first-person perspective. Like I said earlier, this game also brings a unique parry mechanic to the gameplay loop. And no, it's not just a ripoff of Sekiro's parry system. In Elderborn, certain weapons can counter by pushing the right mouse button, meaning that if an enemy attacks you during the counter window, then you'll parry their attack, which slows the game down to a crawl, almost like a bullet time mode from something like Max Payne or The Matrix, and you can get in a few attacks worry-free, and the first attack is also empowered to do massive amounts of damage, which on some of the fodder type enemies, this will just outright kill them. Now with all these enemies, you're bound to rack up a lot of souls. Essence. And so whenever you rest at a healing fountain, you can spend the essence you've gathered up to put into points of one of 3 stats, which either increases attack speed, or health. Also, once you put enough points into one of these 3 stats, you can also unlock a skill that is something like a charged kick, ripping the heads off an enemy and throwing them, or increasing the range in which you absorb essence. The player is also given about 8 weapons or so throughout the game, all of which have slightly different damage numbers as well as attack speeds and whether or not you can use them to block or parry. The designs of these weapons vary from looking like something that was just thrown together in about 2 seconds to some kind of futuristic lightsaber type sword, I don't know, weird future thing. These weapons are found littered throughout the environment, so you always have to be looking to make sure you don't miss a new one, as some of these weapons are just so good and each new one is so different from the last that it really allows each person to find the weapon that really suits how they want to play the game. Now, in all honesty, it's a bit of a lie to simply just compare Elderborn to Dark Souls, as it's also the Dark Messiah sequel that we've always wanted. Dark Messiah was a game made by Arcane, who is now famous for the Dishonored series, and it was a physics-based first-person fantasy RPG type game. And the games Elderborn and Dark Messiah are so similar that they even share the same satisfying yet greatly overpowered kick, in my opinion, as most enemies just instantly crumple to the ground like a sheet of tinfoil with even the slightest tap of your kick. Dark Messiah didn't have the Souls-like aspect to it, as it far predates even Demon Souls, but a lot of the core combat mechanics are so similar, I wouldn't be surprised if at least one of the original creators of Dark Messiah also worked on Elderborn. Now back to the Dark Souls comparisons. Any fan of the Dark Souls series or just the Souls-like genre will know bosses are one of the main reasons people play the games, and are one of the key factors that can make or break any of the Souls-like games. So I'm happy to report that Elderborn gets them right, even though there are really only 2 real boss encounters, which is a bit disappointing. Both bosses felt fair and difficult, but they just felt very generic, and honestly, I couldn't even tell you what they look like. I think the bosses really highlight a big letdown for the game, which is art direction. Bosses are the time to go all out and really tap into the creative side of the world that you're building, but instead, both boss fights just felt like normal enemies scaled up to be boss size. The first boss is a fight with a big dude with a big sword, and I really appreciate that it pretty much requires you to finally master the parry system in this game, as without it, he will kick your shit in about 0.2 seconds and won't spend a single second hesitating. He has plenty of moves to mix things up, and even has a second phase where he starts to go ham. I did die to him a few times, but it always felt fair, and those deaths felt like I just hadn't learned his patterns well enough. The second boss, on the other hand, was okay but not great. It's a 2v1 fight like Ornstein and Smo from Dark Souls, but like the Walmart crackhead version of them. First off, the arena is just a circular arena with mounds of stuff just thrown all over. And next, the whole reason people love Ornstein and Smo is the fight has a nice duality, since they both fight so different but cover each other's weaknesses. But this fight just feels like they made one dude you have to parry and the other one you have to dodge, but they don't really feel like they synergize during the fight. Also, Ornstein and Smo have an interesting mechanic where you can choose who to kill first, and the second one gets buffed when the first dies. So you can sort of pick your poison on who you want to fight last. In Elderborn, because of the way the smaller boss teleports to you at times, it pretty much guarantees that he's going to die first and you have to fight the big one second. To the point where I honestly don't even know if you can kill the small one second. You may have to kill him first. The fight isn't bad and is a good test for a final boss, but it's so clearly a Dark Souls ripoff that you can't help but compare the two fights and just wish you were fighting Ornstein and Smo instead. Overall though, the main thing to gather here is that when it comes time to fight, this game understands how to make an interesting combat that feels easy to learn and hard to master, and just really understands the whole game feel aspect of good game design. Now, for anyone who isn't aware of what I mean when I say game feel, well, it's okay, because no one really knows the true meaning of what game feel is. Game feel is just a term that's been adopted in the last few years as a term to help describe the parts of the game that just feel good, and is kind of that inexplicable part of the game that just makes it stand out from the rest, and are usually the things that make a certain game stand out from other games that it's being compared to or competing with. Good game feel can take many forms and can include any aspect of a game, and for Elderborn it's most definitely its combat. The combat is how the player interacts with the game, and so without good feeling gameplay, the game would fail at its job, so it's a good thing that the developers nailed it. The combat just sorta clicks, and I know that's a bit of a non-answer, But for anyone who has played a game before that has good combat, you often can't give specifics on why it feels better than other games. It just does, and this is the case for Elderborn. The pure dopamine rush I get when I block every attack from half a dozen enemies in the same fight and come out untouched while their mangled corpses lie on the ground or around me is something that will never ever get old, and why I love this game.
Back to it.
The only real gripe I have with this combat is that the big, slow, heavy weapons didn't really feel that useful to me in the game, especially the second area, since the second area really seems to rely on the need to parry enemies, and all the big weapons can only block, so I didn't really touch them for the second half of the game. Also, just something that I needed to add in, and I didn't even realize this until I was writing the script, is that this game actually has an in-game challenge system that will give you essence for completing just miscellaneous challenges. Maybe these challenges pop up at the bottom of the screen where the codex entries pop up, but by putting them in the same location as these codex entries, I just assumed the only thing on the codex tab were lore tidbits, so I never really bothered to check there until I read the codex entries at the end of the game, only to realize they had missed out on dozens of challenges and thousands of essence my entire playthrough. Now, clearly you can beat the game just fine without relying on this challenge system because I didn't use it at all, but it would have been a fun way to get me to use some of the weapons I didn't really touch in my playthrough. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't said anything about the story in this game, which, if you've seen my previous videos, you probably would be able to gather that I'm a huge sucker for a good story, so it's fair to assume then that this one ain't too good, and you'd definitely be right there. Once again, taking a page from its inspiration, the story in terms of the traditional sense is very limited, meaning that there isn't pages of dialogue between characters or hours of cutscenes to watch, and instead the game relies on world building and text-based lore tidbits that you find in the world. The problem here though is that none of it's really that interesting in my opinion. The main reason that Dark Souls pulls off its limited form of storytelling and all the games that try to copy it have failed is that Dark Souls doesn't use its limited dialogue and cutscenes as a cop-out and instead uses this as a way of intrigue. What I mean by this is that anyone who plays Dark Souls is likely instantly intrigued by the intro cutscene as it sets up the history of the world and how you fit into it, and it's also very wide sweeping without over explaining things, such as the intro cutscene explains what a Dark Soul is, but most people on their first playthrough still won't understand what it even is with this cutscene, but all of it draws the player in and makes them want to explore and learn more about this world that has been set up. By building this intrigue right from the get-go, you already give the player incentive to push forward as the player moves forward in hopes of getting even the slightest clue of what is going on in the game. As the player pushes through the tutorial level and the starting areas, they'll likely start to learn the game won't be handing out information easily, and they have to do a lot of figuring out on their own. So the player does just that, and I'm not saying everyone's going to understand the story as much as Vati Vidya on their first go-around, but they likely will get enough to feel like the world that they're traveling isn't as foreign as when they first opened that cell door in the Undead Burg. Dark Souls also uses its lack of a traditional narrative to use its gameplay as a way to tell the story, as the act of respawning in the game is explained by the lore of the game, as your character is an undead, which is a person sort of in a purgatory between life and death, and that's why even when you die you can always come back. Now, since the gameplay of Dark Souls is easily its most prominent aspect, it's smart to use things that you do in your minute-to-minute gameplay to help the player connect with the story. Respawning in games is often a disconnect for players, as not only does it take them out of the action, but also there's a disconnect as we died as the player, but in the narrative of most games they never acknowledge that the player has ever died. So by explaining a mechanic as integral as respawning, the player doesn't get that disconnect anymore, and it keeps them engaged with the world even through death, and it tells the story both through world building and gameplay with this simple mechanic. Now, all of this depth, intrigue, and nuance are sorely lacking in Elderborn, and it really shows why Dark Souls has yet to really be bested at what it does. Elderborn starts with a cutscene which is only slightly animated, as it's sort of like a drawing on an ancient scroll or something, and I understand this was likely done because they didn't feel like they had the skill to make a well-made cutscene, or they didn't have the budget for anything more complex, or just a combination of the two. This cutscene starts out interesting, but very quickly you hear the voice acting, which is honestly just pretty terrible. Now, I know Dark Souls also has some really corny and cheesy voice lines, but that's mostly just up to the actual script and not the voice actors. At least with the female voice actor in Elderborn, it really just sounds like one of the developers that was dragged into the recording booth one lunch.
A hero anointed by the elders, standing a giant among men.
After the cutscene plays, you're thrust right into the character and you just start pushing forward. And very quickly, even in the tutorial area, you'll notice the art of the levels isn't very varied or inspired, and even in 30 minutes, it'll feel like you've been walking the same corridors the whole time, which is a bit of a problem when one of the main forms of storytelling in the genre is world building, which you can't really do when you're looking at the same two tombs over and over again. Dark Souls has dozens of different areas in the game, all with unique looks and feels that all tell their own stories, as well as connecting to the other areas of the game as you're slowly building an ever-growing narrative of the world that you're carving a path through. And spoiler alert, but there are only really 2 areas in the entire game, and they're definitely unique from one another, I'll give them that, but they have plenty of repetitiveness as well as no real standout locations in them or reasons to really scour every corner of them, which knocks out yet another form of storytelling for Elderborn. Dark Souls, on the other hand, has some of the most iconic locations from the last decade. You have Anor Londo, the Undead Burg, the Abyss, Artorias' Arena, Firelink Shrine, and all this is just from the first game, and all of these places work because they have a purpose to the story and a connection to the rest of the world on top of looking visually pleasing and varied, of course. Next, Elderborn fumbles once again as its lore book type storytelling falls flat on its face. The game either gives you these lore books through finding generic rune-based writings or killing a certain amount of a certain enemy type. The problem is that the enemy type lore doesn't really do a great job at explaining their place in the world, and the lore walls lack all the nuance of Dark Souls by having a carefully crafted scene around where a specific lore bit is picked up. The issue with the world lore as well is that it doesn't do a good job at connecting all the parts of the world together, and it also feels like it explains far too much about a part of the world you never see, which just leads to confusion. This means that the final pillar of the storytelling for this game crumbles and finally takes the whole house down with it. So, in summary, I feel on a personal level, the story failed to connect with me, and from a technical level, I feel this game failed as well, as it failed to engage the player in any form of storytelling that it chose to use. So, I know I just spent a good few minutes ranting about why this story sucks, but I don't want this to be misconstrued as me hating this game, as it's far from that actually. But like I said at the start of this rant, I'm a huge sucker for a good story, so not having a good story is something that I just have to talk about. Maybe some of you will enjoy the story more than I did, and even if not, I highly doubt the lack of the story is actually going to taint your view on the combat or the rest of the game at all. Elderborn tries to be different from the rest of the pack by adding a few new things to the mix. Most notably, it's changed to a first-person perspective, and it actually pulls this off with a surprising amount of success. But with its lackluster story, I can't help but feel that the developers didn't really understand what made Dark Souls' story so good, despite having so little dialogue or cutscenes. The smaller scope of the development also rears its head in the game, as you see lots of repeated enemies and reused locations and assets, but For a small studio such as Hyperstrange, and for this to be their debut game, is quite the feat, as being able to nail such a visceral and satisfying combat on their first outing is quite the accomplishment, and not something even FromSoft could nail down until Bloodborne, I would argue. The story definitely keeps it from reaching anything that could steal the attention of any Dark Souls lore junkie, but the gameplay more than makes up for it. Elderborn released back in the beginning of this year, and since then hasn't really seen any major or minor success, but given its super cheap asking price and its relatively short runtime of about 4 hours, it's a great little addition to add to the pantheon of the Souls-like genre, that, despite its small scope, manages to punch far above its weight class many times, and it really deserves to be experienced by more fans of the genre. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like, as it really helps me out a lot. And if you didn't like it, be sure to leave a dislike as well and let me know in the comments on what I can do better. Subscribe if you want to see my future content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.